Welcome to the 22nd season of the Witte Speaker Series. I'm delighted to have you all here. My name is Janet Hadley, and I'm the chairperson of the Speaker Selection Committee. And some of the other members of the committee are here. Signe Keller is here, Liz Ann Witte is here, Mark Murray is here. Who am I missing? Ellen Shawcrow is here, and Diane Hafer is here. This happens because of them. They've been devoted to this committee for some time now, and we go through a really fun process of selecting speakers. And we would love to know who you would like to have us bring to the library, so share that with any of us anytime. How many of you are here for the first time? Thank you very much for coming. And how many people here are foundation members? Lovely to see you all, and thank you for your support of the foundation. The foundation funds and creates programs that reach across many generations in this library. Most of you are familiar with the children's programs. We have Library Live, and I think my favorite, most recent discovery is, are you all familiar with the E branch of the library? One of the things the foundation, the unrestricted donations to the foundation fund, for example, is the Wi-Fi here. So 250,000 connections a year, which we wouldn't have without the availability of Wi-Fi, and that's because of the foundation and your support of the foundation. There's another great program called Canopy, Canopy with a K, where you can tap into using your library card and go into the website, and you can watch movies. So cheaper than Netflix, supporting your library. The donors that you've seen displayed up here are people who have donated funds to the foundation and have restricted the funds to the support of this particular speaker series. And so there's a special place in my heart for all of those people, because the cost of the ticket does not pay for our speakers. So thank you very much to all of those generous sponsors. As you know, our goal is to bring you speakers that range through current events, science, literature, art, and almost any other topic you can think of if it seems to be of contemporary interest. Tonight's presentation yielded an interesting discussion on our committee, as you can imagine. I think that we were brave to bring an author who would have the courage to entitle her book, The End of Men. And the Rise of Women. Hanna comes to us from Washington, D.C. I am very proud that she's here. She writes for Atlantic, Slate. She has INVISIBILIA on NPR. And she wrote this book some time ago and said, in our recent times, it has become popular again. So she will tell us all about that. Please be sure to join us for a light supper and wine and continue the conversation that I'm sure will be stimulated by her presentation tonight. I hope you'll look at the rest of the series. Our next speaker will be Richard Blanco, who was an inaugural poet, and he writes about how arts can help us through these times as far as our civic lives go. So that's for the future, but tonight we have Hanna Rosin. Welcome to the library.
Hi. I want to thank the men. You're the brave ones to come to a talk called The End of Men. I especially want to thank the men who were forced to come here. I know that you're out there, because they're always out there in these talks. I just want to say it's a safe space. I have 2 sons, so I don't actually hate men, I promise. I don't hate my sons. Anyway. Okay, well, let's get going. So it is hard to remember now. But when the election happened, we actually thought that the main issue was going to be about the state of feminism in America, and could a woman be president? You guys remember that? Was our country ready for a first female president? But that is not what happened. Instead, the surprise was that the 2016 election became a forum on masculinity.
And your testosterone is 441, which is actually good.
Okay, so there was a lot that went on in that election of Trump. There was a self-praise. Uh-oh, I can't move to the next slide. Oh, here we go. Okay, there was Trump talking about the size of his hands.
Those hands, are they small hands?
Not small hands.
He referred to my hands. If they're small, something else must be small. I guarantee you there's no problem. I guarantee. All right. Okay.
So you guys are thanking me for these memories. I know that you are. There were the insults. He called low energy Jeb. I think that was it. Hold on. Let me finish. Low energy Jeb, little Marco. She doesn't have the fortitude or strength. Anyway, my point is, it wasn't that subtle. Like with some politicians, you really have to read between the lines, pick up the meaning underneath the meaning. But with Trump, it was like the man with the biggest hands is going to win this election. It was not subtle. But the question that you did have to ask was, who was Trump talking to? Like writers, politicians are always talking to a specific audience between the lines. And I would say that Trump knew what he was doing with all of this, and he was talking to men. And more specifically, he was talking to white men, and more specifically, white men who since 2012 were being lectured by certain feminist writers that their time was up and that they were ending, which made them more upset, which only fueled them more to show up and vote for the one person who understood their pain, to which I will say, you're welcome. Anyway, I wrote this book a few years ago, and lots of people said that it was a provocative, obnoxious title, and that they had certain ideas about what this book was about, that I was like a rabid feminist, and I hoped that men would die. And one of those people was, any of you watch Orange is the New Black? Okay, here we go. Hold on.
You know, you should read this book. It's called The End of Men. In it, they talk about how pretty soon men are going to become irrelevant. Now, women are more educated. They're going to make more money and pretty much run everything.
Really? Well, they don't like be the president.
Exactly. It's the lesbians that started this whole thing. They're making babies out of a tube.
All right, we'll stop there. Anyway, so The End of Men is not about how men are irrelevant or how women are going to run everything. It's not particularly about the secret lesbian agenda, although if you read it backwards, it might be about the secret lesbian agenda. But what it is about how the dynamics of men and women, between men and women, have changed really, really, really fast. It is a purely repertorial book. It doesn't particularly have an ideological agenda. In those years that I wrote this book, I was running a feminist website, and it honestly was just me noticing a bunch of data happening in the country which was surprising and alarming and which has turned many people's worlds upside down, and a lot of people really do not like it, as we've seen in the many years since this has happened. So actually that reminds me of something I'd forgotten until today. I recently got a letter from someone who read the book, and he was like, what's the problem? Like, I go to the park and I like take care of my baby and nobody says anything to me. It's from a guy. And then I looked at the envelope and he was from Portland, Oregon. So I was like, okay, you know, maybe in Portland nobody cares, but in the rest of the country people do really care. So let's zoom in a little closer and talk about the history of this and how we got here. Okay, so this is the set of headlines that were prevalent in 2009 when I started noticing this. Now, this was the height of the Great Recession. I myself, as I said, had just founded this women's site. And you could notice during the recession that the industries dominated by men were really, really hard hit, first by the recession and then by the housing crisis. But, you know, okay, so sometimes industries are hard hit. You don't really know, you can't really notice what the dynamics are underneath. But then it started to look like this was not just a temporary thing, that it was going to be really permanent. So I'm just going to give you guys a few numbers just to ground us so we're both talking about the same thing. In the 1960s, almost all men between the ages of 25 and 54 were working. Now, about 20% of men are not working. And that's because in the latest ranking of professions, the jobs that are disappearing are men's jobs. They're car repair, electronics, shipbuilding. These are just lists of professions. Some are disappearing and some are rising. The exact opposite was happening to jobs that are dominated by women. So the 15 jobs projected to grow the fastest were healthcare, healthcare industry, and service professions, both of which are industries that are dominated by women. Now, why did this happen? Partly it's because of something that I call the traveling sisterhood, which is to say that in the 60s and 70s, for those of you who were around, you noticed there was a huge explosion of women going to law school and sort of joining professions at the top. So what does that mean? That means that women are not doing the things that women used to do for free, like make meals or take care of children. And so that opened up a whole bunch of jobs in the other parts of the economy for the things that women used to do at home and for free. So it's like the more women started going to law school and medical school, the more jobs opened up for women at the other end of the scale. And so the result was, if you can look, women are a majority in American workplaces. 51.4% of women are in managerial jobs. This wasn't, as I was noticing in 2009, just like a slight upticking. What it looked like is that there was a temporary reset in the economy, that something was actually flipping in a kind of permanent way. And the main reason was because the global economy was shifting from an economy of people's hands, like a manufacturing economy, to an economy of thoughts and forced smiles. And so if you just Google the list of the most popular professions in America, you get like salesperson, cashier, food preparation, all of which are jobs that women do really well. So when you ask economists why actually that's a good one, I'm gonna stay on that one. Well, we'll get to that later, actually. So you ask economists, why are certain women having an easier time finding work in this economy? The key is flexibility or adaptability. So the job market changes really, really quickly. The place you notice this is in community colleges. In community colleges, you get a pretty good barometer of kind of where is the economy going, because people are being trained for jobs that exist right now. And it turns out that women are just more flexible, like they just adapt to what's happening more quickly. Why? There's a few theories for why women are more flexible. One is that they're underdogs. Like, if you're at the bottom, you just learn by necessity to be more flexible. If you're at the top, you're not really used to being more flexible, so you just kind of get stuck. Some people's theory is that it's children. There's actually an economic theory called the last one holding the bag theory, which means that it's actually an official name for the economic theory, and it means that because women are the ones who have the children, they just have to go to work and take the jobs that are available, and so they do them. Now, what about the men? My favorite theory is that the men are suffering from something called masculine mystique. Do you guys remember the feminine mystique? Remember Betty Friedan? Okay, so what was the idea of Betty Friedan? It was this idea that women were defined culturally in such a narrow way that it was suffocating them, like they felt like they couldn't move. So there's an idea that men are defined right now in such a narrow way that it's very hard for them to adapt to the jobs that exist. The American Psychological Association just this week actually passed guidelines. Have any of you seen these? These guidelines for treating men and boys, and they define this thing, it's actually very controversial, called the masculinist ideology, which is that the more you ascribe to this idea of a man can only be one way, the more you kind of get stuck in a certain segment of the economy. So in my book, there's some story of guys in Alabama where the manufacturing jobs have left, and the only jobs left are working in government and working in healthcare. And when I ask a lot of the guys, well, why don't you just get a government job or a healthcare job? They just won't do it because that's women's work. It's just too hard for them to get around it and kind of change their personalities to adapt. Now I'm going to tell you the last straightforward theory of why men get stuck. It's the paycheck theory, which is that the jobs that women do are generally paid less and valued less by the economy, like nursing and teaching. So the men are basically like, screw it, I'd rather go fishing. Like, why should I work for $10 an hour? That's true. I've seen that phenomenon too. Okay. Let's talk about education. So here's a very important and stubborn statistic. For every 3 degrees women earn, men earn 2. That has been true since the 60s. It's true all over the world. The difference between now and the 60s is that it actually matters. All sorts of jobs that used to be, you didn't need a college degree for, like police officer. Now you need a college degree for practically every job. So it becomes a real problem that men cannot have a hard time getting college degrees. So why do women get more degrees? It's definitely not because they are smarter. Sorry. It has to do with being hardworking and disciplined. Here is an education expert. It is my daughter.
Bring it on.
Bring it on.
The girls are obviously smarter. I mean, they have much larger vocabulary. They learn much faster. They are more controlled. On the board today for losing recess tomorrow, only boys.
And why is that?
Showing they were just not listening to the class while the girls sat there very nicely and did their thing. They were more versatile.
I like to stop it right there. Anyway, I really do love my sons. My daughter's in college now. She would kill me if she knew I was still showing this video. Anyway, so the moment I decided to write this book, this is a true story, is when I was at a college in Kansas. I purposely went to a working class school. It was a state school. Most people were commuters. I purposely chose girls who were not like liberal to talk to. In fact, both of them were cheerleaders. And their boyfriends came by. And I recall that when I was in college, I just had this kind of general idea that if I got married, I would have an equal relationship and I would work and my husband would work. I mean, this is just my ideal. I'm not saying it worked out that way, but that's just my ideal. And they had a completely different way of talking about their boyfriends. It was basically like, ugh, he's playing video games all the time. And I had to drag him to the office so he could go to the professional career. I had really never heard people talk that way before. And this is what the girl said to me. She looked at her 2 friends at the table and she said, "Men are the new ball and chain." That's her quote, not mine. So, for a long time, this was the image of rugged American manhood that dominated, tough, rugged, in control of his environment. And just a few years ago, it was replaced by that specimen, the Old Spice man, which is to say, a parody of rugged American manhood. The second moment when I decided I was going to write this book is that I was looking into a completely different story. I was talking to a fertility clinic and discovered that 75% of American couples request girls and not boys. And the real kicker to this was that it's true even in South Korea. I did a lot of my research in South Korea. They have had a son preference forever and ever. I have a feminist podcast or a podcast about women's issues, and one of our most loyal listeners, it turns out, is somebody who works in the South Korean demographic office. Go figure. So I was talking about this, and he sent me all the statistics about South Korean demographics, and it turns out that it's like they track everything in South Korea, couple preferences, marriages, babies born, and one of the things they've always tracked is South Korean couples and do they want a boy or a girl, and it was a boy, 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 boy for decades, and then around the 90s it started to shift, and then just sort of like in 1998 it just takes a nosedive, and South Korean couples are requesting girls. Now, why is that? It's just like something broke loose. South Korean women started going to college. Korean women started working. There's a million cultural reasons, but I felt like we had reached the moment when around the world we were in a kind of cultural free fall, and many people don't like it and are not prepared for it. And that's where we are. So now we're going to look at the consequences of this new reality on actual human relationships, from dating to marriage to work. Okay, that's where it gets more fun. So, back in 2012, when I was writing this book, there was some very prurient anthropology going on about the hookup culture. Now, sometimes I have college students, an audience full of college students. That's not the case here, so I'm going to define hookup culture. No, I'm not, no offense. All I'm saying is it's not an audience full of college students, that's all. Anyway, we'll just define it in a basic way. I'm sure your children have done this for you. Physical intimacy without long-term commitment. How's that? That's a clean definition. That's all I'm saying. So, from the vantage point of a generation older than college age, this is a kind of boys' fantasy world. And it's like, oh, wow, like I wish I had this when I was in college. And it's the dating world that men would invent if only they dared to, and women just had to suffer through it. That was kind of the idea about the hookup culture. But when I was writing this book, there was an amazing research experiment underway at a Midwestern college. This is you think I'm brave to write a book called The End of Men. Let me tell you what brave looks like. Middle-aged professors moved into a college dorm for 4 years, and they lived in this college dorm, and all they did was talk to people about their dating lives. Now, the reason they did this is because they really wanted to know what was the hookup culture like, what did it look like, what did men think, what did women think, and initially they got a lot of people complaining, oh, these men, the men, whatever, the normal stuff complaining about men, women, dating, but then their names were Elizabeth Armstrong and Linda Hamilton. Do you remember that? There's like a Drew Barrymore movie where Drew Barrymore goes to college. Anyway, so what they discovered was, in fact, women were avoiding long-term commitment. They would say things like, well, I can't really have a boyfriend right now because that's the equivalent of another 4-credit class, and I just don't have time for that right now. It's too much work, and I have other things to do. So the point was, at that age, before women have children, they were just like super focused on establishing themselves, establishing their careers. So in a sense, the hookup culture was working for them because they actually did not want to leave college with a strong commitment. So this was just a completely different take because it was a long-term take on what was going on. I'm going to read a letter that somebody wrote me, because I wrote a story about the hookup culture and the findings of the study, and some woman wrote me and said, look, you've defined what the hookup culture is not, but you haven't said what it is, so I'm just going to read this letter, because I like it. She says, we want a person to hook up with, but also to hang out with, but none of the stifling constraints and stodgy strictures of the old-school boyfriend-girlfriend commitments. This is a woman. We don't want to be compelled by expectations to do each other's laundry or bring each other chicken soup when one of us is sick. We don't even want to see each other every day and watch a sappy movie on a Friday night and snuggle. Now, this is my whole life, whatever. She's just, insulting. I'm saying me, it's my whole life that she's insulting. And I'm sure some of you. But anyway, yes, some of us want that, but not every night and not every weekend. We certainly don't want these relationships to get in the way of other important things in our life. We are putting ourselves first. Some might call it selfish. We call it smart and independent and secure. Okay, so that's a completely different take on what was going on between college men and women. Now, that's when I wrote this book in 2012. Let's fast forward to 2016. The newspapers are filled every day with accounts of campus rape and assaults and Title IX hearings. If you read the New York Times, it was like on the cover all the time in 2016. I read those stories and I thought, I must have gotten something wrong here. It feels like there's something shaky in this view of the hookup culture. How do I square this with what I wrote in this book, that women are driving the hookup culture? So there's 2 ways to square this. One is that women and feminists are fooling themselves, that in fact this kind of dating doesn't work for them, and you can't actually have it all, and you can't have everything you want, and you can't have total freedom and feel secure. This attitude about sex is just too confusing and doesn't work for women and makes them feel too vulnerable. My second theory is that everything I just said is stupid and insulting, and women do want a hookup culture, but they just want it on decent terms. I'm not sure. We can discuss it afterwards. I don't really know what it means. I'm just saying it did make me feel like this hookup culture study was more complicated than I thought. Now let's fast forward to 2017, only 1 year later, and the women's movement is swallowed up by Me Too, which in the flowchart of men falling, women rising is also a really confusing one. Because on the one hand, it does show the end of men. We have titans of the patriarchy are getting toppled day after day after day. You can't believe such powerful men are falling off their pedestal. I actually thought to myself one day, I didn't mean the end of men literally. There was a day when they were just one after another, were just falling down. Anyway, it's like Harvey Weinstein, they just went one after another. Anyway, on the other hand, if you think about it, women are using this moment to kind of highlight their vulnerability. Like, that's what Me Too is also about. So it's this very confusing combination of power and vulnerability, which I can't totally square on the end of men continuum. Okay, so let's leave dating for a moment and talk about marriage. The rise of women is having a significant, profound effect on American marriage patterns. And this is bifurcated depending on what class you come from. So, you know that famous episode of I Love Lucy when like the men stay home and the women go to work? It was like, ha ha ha, of course that's how it works out. Women couldn't possibly go to work and men couldn't possibly stay home. It would never work. So now you're in 2018. You have about, at this point, 40% of women who are the main breadwinners of their family, which means they literally make more money than their male partners. And that doesn't count single mothers who completely run their household. So that's a kind of shocking statistic. And for college-educated couples, this translates into what I call seesaw marriage, which means that theoretically, at any point in time, the man could play the dominant role, or, now this is just heterosexual marriages, but the man could play the dominant role or the woman could play the dominant role. So the Obamas have a seesaw marriage. When Barack Obama was a professor, Michelle Obama was a healthcare executive. She made a lot more money than he did, so he could have his political career, and then they've switched over time. It's very common. However, guess who doesn't have a seesaw marriage and has never had one? So the Trumps, very, very notably, definitely don't have a seesaw marriage. If you read these quotes, I think putting a wife to work is a very dangerous thing, etc. The softness disappeared. I love that one. Anyway, I actually think that the way that Donald Trump talks about women and marriage is a big part of his appeal, that it shows you there's a tremendous hunger and yearning for things to go back to the way that things used to be, and for the masculine to be the masculine, the feminine to be the feminine, for it not to be confused. And if you read online, if you read Reddit or any of the kind of man forums online, what you basically see is a lot of like science and biology about what is the feminine and what is the masculine. And there's just been this tremendous yearning, much of which is a backlash to the dynamics that I describe in the book. We will get to that a little more later. So I don't really know what to say about why this is happening, this kind of switch in marriage relations. The conservative view is that, we've become a selfish culture and nobody worries about their obligations anymore. They just think about their happiness. But there's another theory, which is just this is very rational thinking on the part of working class women. They don't find men around them who are suitable partners, so they just don't get married, even though they would very much like to get married. The heartbreak for me is that there's really a class bifurcation in stable marriage these days. So for college-educated people who only make up 30% of the population, marriages are as stable and measure as happy as they have in American history. But for everybody else, marriages are tremendously unstable, and single motherhood is like astronomically high, which leaves you the impression that stable marriage has become a luxury. It's become a class luxury, like so many other things in America. Marriage is now a luxury. Okay, so where do we go from here? On the one hand, a huge amount has changed. Women are presidential candidates. Anyone know how many female presidential candidates we have right now? 4. Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Tulsi Gabbard. That's 4. That's a lot. TV anchors, college presidents, bank presidents, CEOs, movie directors, and comedians who make as many toilet jokes as men do. Also, if you read airport books about leadership, if you guys have been reading books about leadership for years and years, you'll note that there is a huge shift now, and being a good leader these days in the kind of airport leader mode requires you to incorporate a lot of what we have thought of as traditionally feminine qualities. So you no longer read metaphors about a leader being like a military, you don't have military metaphors anymore. Instead, what you have is like, it's not like just, be aggressive. It's like inspire your team and motivate people and learn to listen. It's like incorporates a lot of qualities that we think of as traditionally feminine. But also, there's a huge backlash against that. A woman who is bossing people, no matter what, no matter how many times they've measured it, still causes a kind of visceral, instinctive flinch. So, in the late 90s, there was a series of popular books called Nice Girls Don't Get the Corner Office. So I'm going to read a quote from one of these books. If you worry about offending others and back down too easily, or insist on workplace displays of girlish behavior, that's for all you people who bake muffins for your colleagues, stop it, then you are sabotaging your career. Okay, that was the advice that we gave women in the 90s. That turned out to be like really stupid advice because people don't like it. People react badly to it. Like the culture is just not ready for it. So there's these amazing studies done by a psychologist at New York University. She's one of these people who like hands out resumes, a male resume and a female resume. In one case, all they said about the person in the two resumes was that the person is a stellar performer or a rising star. These are the famous Andrea James studies. Andrea's in one pile, James is in the other. Now, they didn't say anything else except the person's a stellar performer. And then they ask people to rate the person whose resume they're looking at, and people just assumed that Andrea was really difficult to work with and someone you wouldn't want to have lunch with. And it basically, just because she was a stellar performer, they assumed that she must have been unpleasant. My least favorite study involves an intern Xeroxing things. And essentially the study goes like this. It's like there's an office networking event, and right by the door there's an intern, they stage this study, and there's an intern Xeroxing things, and they ask the people at work, the intern asks them for help in collating the Xeroxes, and they basically watch who gets penalized for continuing on to the networking event and not helping the intern Xerox. And guess who gets penalized? Guess who people hate for not helping the intern do the Xeroxing? It's only women who suffer for not helping the intern do the damn Xeroxing. Like they can't find a second intern to help the intern do the Xeroxing. But it turns out that you just women get penalized for not behaving in a kind of friendly, communal way. Okay, so luckily, a few years ago, another person at the Kennedy School said, what am I going to do with this frustrating situation? I'm going to create a script for women so they know how to behave in the workplace. I'm going to test this script on you guys just to see how smart you are. Here's the situation. A woman is asking for a raise. I'm going to read you 3 ways that the woman could ask for a raise, and I'm going to ask you to vote on the way that you think is the right way. I'll see how smart you are, and if you are smart, I will reward you with a reason why the right answer is true. Okay, you ready? Number 1, the woman says, I think I should be paid at the top of that range, and I would also like to be eligible for an end-of-the-year bonus. Number 2, I hope it's okay to ask you about this. I'd feel terrible if I offended you in doing so. Number 3, I don't know how typical it is for people at my level to negotiate, but I'm hopeful that you'll see my skill at negotiating as something helpful I bring to the job. Who votes for number 1? I should be paid at the top of the range. Okay, it's healthy. Who votes for number 2? Nobody ever votes for number 2. Who votes for number 3? I'm going to close my eyes. You guys are so smart. Okay, that's the right answer. Why is that the right answer? Because if you think of a mom running into the school and demanding something for her child, basically saying like, I need my child to be in a certain class, does that violate anybody's idea? This is a real pushy move, but does that violate anybody's idea of how women behave? No, it doesn't, because women are allowed to be aggressive on behalf of the institution. It's like self-starter if you're also a team player. That stereotype is true for women. So what they decided was a woman, I interviewed Sheryl Sandberg for my book. This is literally how she negotiated for her job. You have to say as a woman, I am negotiating for myself in order to show you how good I will be in the future at negotiating for your company. So you see how it works? Like you're allowed to advocate for yourself if you also advocate for everyone else, which is annoying. And the researcher said, She wishes she had come to a different conclusion, but she didn't. So that's just how it is. You can take the advice or leave it, but that is the thing that seems to work. I'll give you another example, actually, because it's interesting. A woman came to the researchers and said, here's my situation. I just found out that the guy who works for me is making more money than I am. I supervise him and he's making more money, and this is so sexist, and I'm so angry about this. I'm going to go to my boss and say this is sexist. And they said, no, that's the wrong thing to do, because all you're doing is reinforcing your place in the hierarchy. What you have to do is say to them, you really don't want to be running a company where subordinates get paid more than their superiors, because that creates chaos in the company. So I'm just telling you, for your sake, you better fix this remedy. So anyway, that's the cross to bear. It'll change, but right now, that's how it is. Okay, so that's the backlash. Now I'm going to tell you about the real backlash, the big cultural backlash going on against the things that I describe. I keep in touch with, if you read the book, a lot of it is about working class men, because that's the place where you see these dynamics change and just change the most drastically, where the manufacturing economy has really been destroyed. And I keep in touch with with a lot of the men. I keep in touch with them on Facebook, the men who I wrote about. And one thing I started to notice in the last couple of years is there used to be a lot of shame around talking about this. I saw lots of situations in Alabama, for example, where the wife was the only one working. She'd just leave the paycheck on the table. The husband wasn't working, and there was no discussion between them about what was happening. There was just like this big source of shame about what was happening to the men. Now, a few years later, there is no shame. It's become a grand cultural narrative of kind of resentment, and it's got channeled into Trump and to polarization. You can watch YouTube videos. There's just a huge universe you can tap into, and it's like a cultural identity. Male victimhood is a proud and open and loud cultural identity. That is a big shift from a few years ago. So I guess it's better than shame, but it's also like wreaking havoc on America, so maybe it's not better than shame. I don't know. Anyway, it's become a big grand cultural narrative. So in 1991, Susan Faludi wrote a book called Backlash, in which she argued that sort of women's movement forward invariably is met by huge backlash. And I think that is exactly what's happening now. So, and if you heard of Jordan Peterson, here's Jordan Peterson. He's probably, I would say maybe at this point, the most mild form of the backlash. If any of you have read his book, he sort of teaches men to be upstanding citizens and clean their rooms and all kinds. He talks to men like they're babies, but also he's got a lot of strange ideas about women.
Please take the position.
So let me come back to my
absolute
question.
all-out warfare.
Is gender equality a myth?
I don't know what you mean by the question. Men and women aren't the same, and they won't be the same. That doesn't mean they can't be treated fairly.
Okay, I don't want to hear more of that. So anyway, as I was saying, a lot of this is, some of it is angry, some of it is just nostalgic, and sometimes it's just having fun. Like sometimes the men on the web just like to mess around. But the underlying idea, there are two underlying ideas. One is that, this is a nanny state, and I don't want to be controlled by a nanny state. This came down hard on Hillary Clinton. Who knows how it's going to affect the rest of the female candidates, but just this idea that, I don't want my mommies lecturing me and telling me what to do. And some of it is just this prevailing ideology out there about the fixed nature of women and the fixed nature of men and how that's been forgotten. And there's all kinds of evolutionary biology about exactly the ways that men and women are different. Now, I can see you all thinking men and women are different, and I know that they're different, but we haven't tested the kind of limits of that difference, and it certainly is not as culturally meaningful as people on the web seem to think it is, and a lot of it is just kind of yearning for an earlier era when things meant something else. Now, here's another guy who I want you guys to be exposed to named Ben Shapiro, who's kind of the cute, cruder version of... Look at that face. All right. Oh, I don't want to go to him yet. Ugh. Let's see if we can play this.
This is an article from Jennifer Finney Boylan, a contributing opinion writer over at the New York Times, demonstrating the radicalism of the left. Jennifer, who is a transgender woman, meaning a biological man, says, why are gender reveal parties a thing? If you don't think there's a difference between men and women, you are a fool. I don't just mean in genitals. I mean in terms of how men and women think and act. Obviously, there is a difference. But according to Jennifer Boylan, this is unacceptable because we can't, if you find out that you have a boy in the womb, you can't just assume that that boy is going to be a boy. Maybe the boy is going to be a girl. To suggest that confusing a child for a full generation about sex being completely malleable has no impact on the kids is insane.
Okay, so I play that clip for you because I just want to give you a sense that this is the culture war that we're in right now. It's about gender identity. If any of you have kids, I have kids in high school and college, it's like shocking, basically, at least in a city where I live, how fluidly they think about gender roles and also how fluidly they think about sexuality, which are two different things. But it really is kind of a whole new world out there among young people, their sexuality, their gender expression. It really is very different. So you've got this incredible backlash coming down from the other side. No, these are bright lines. Men are like this and women are like this. And this is like a coming war in the definition of what men are and what women are. And then you've got Elliot Rogers, the subworld of incels who are involuntary celibates. This is the most radical expression of this ideology that I'm talking about, in which this economic theories of sort of men are one way or women in one way are taken to their absolute extreme, and ideas about a dating marketplace and how there are these mutant men who are just not genetically suited to have a partner. And so people have gotten like really, really scientific about what the breakdown in gender relations has meant for them. And this is the most depressing expression. Okay, I don't want to leave you like this. We're going to do a little bit of a hopeful view. So here's the positive possibility that the current backlash is, it's just a backlash. There's always a backlash. It's the last gasp. It's an anomaly. The tide of history is going how it's going how I described in the book, and that's just how it's going to be. Now, if you think about it, men have been at the top of the hierarchy for like 40,000 years. So it should not be surprising that it's difficult to accommodate to that dominance fading. And in some ways, it's bringing around good things. I'm going to bring you some sort of hopeful headlines. This is kind of an interesting one, that Me Too has kind of led to a new era of female leadership. That might make you happy. And then the thing that makes me happiest actually is how television handles this. There's a shocking number of kind of new configurations in television. After I wrote the book, the most fun responses I had were from TV writers. So in the year the book came out, there was no fewer than, I think, 7 TV shows and pilots which were made, which were mostly like sitcoms in which they kind of switched up the roles of men and women. There was a show called Up All Night, which ran for a few seasons, which was about a stay-at-home dad and his wife who went to work. There was a Chris Rock movie, What to Expect When You're Expecting, in which like they just had the guys walking around the park with their baby Bjorns. You didn't even know, like, was it Tuesday and none of them were working, or was it Saturday and it was a men's group? You had no idea. Nobody commented on it. It's just like how it was. Okay, Katniss Everdeen. So this is an amazing one because if any of you have seen The Hunger Games, that's a total gender reversal. She's the kind of unpleasant hero who grows into her role, and Peeta, the guy in the movie, he's like the baker, he's the romantic, he's the one who is pleasant and people like him, and he softens everything. And so, you know, that's a real sort of reversal. And once I tried this out on my daughter, who's a teenager, and I told her what I thought of this, and she was like, and? So that was even more hopeful that she didn't even know what I was talking about or think it was interesting, because it's like, whatever. So here's where I'm playing to the crowd. It's not just young girls who can hold guns and weapons, and, you know, it applies to all of us. The Incredibles 2. One I love. There's just a huge... Did any of you see The Incredibles 2? Okay, that's a total End of Men book, really. That's a very End of Men plot in the beginning where she has to go off and save the world, and he's stuck at home dealing with the baby. And again, it's not really a thing. It's just how it is these days. So I really do think, if I'm judging from my daughter and her teenage friends, that they are moving towards a world where it is a lot less shocking for people to step out of these rigid roles, a lot less anomalous. And people often ask me, like, well, where do you want the world to go? And I think the way I think of it is that let's say there's this, over here is like a palette of what we call traditionally feminine traits. So you'd think like, think back to what the list would look like in the 50s. It would be like nurturing, maternal. There'd just be a list of traditionally female traits. And then there'd be this other list of traditionally masculine traits. And I think in an ideal world, you as a human would just get to pick and choose between those traits. So if you happen to be a man who's more maternal and you want to stay home and take care of the kids, and somebody saw you in a park on a Tuesday, they wouldn't think like, what's wrong with you, or what's wrong with him, or why doesn't he have a job? They'd just be like, bye, have a nice time at the park. They would just pass by and not think twice about it. Or if you happen to be a woman who's especially aggressive and dominant, you don't happen to want to follow that annoying script about how you should ask for a raise, you can just do that and not pay a tremendous penalty. So that's my ideal world, and I think that's all I have to say. I would be happy to hear from you guys about what you guys think should happen. So thank you very much. Yes.
So, to what degree do you think this is mostly a U.S. phenomenon versus?
Not a U.S. phenomenon. Not a U.S. phenomenon.
All of our jobs, men are losing or going someplace else, and that applies to men are still maintaining their.
No, because the entire those jobs just don't exist. Like there are. Let me think. Where are the manufacturing jobs? I mean, what I would say about America, the difference to me between America and Europe or America and other places is that this is a capitalism problem, this is not a male-female problem, but other places planned a little better for this transition. So I think other places saw the end of the manufacturing economy and they tried to redefine how men would work or what they were going to do with people or redefine a social safety net. We did not. Actually, so we sort of created this problem for ourselves. But I think the entire world is moving towards a service economy and information economy. So it's just the way the global economy works now. So I don't think it's actually very different. Yes. It's usually only women who ask me questions. Yeah. Yes. Those are all different. There's different answers to all those. So Japan has a huge end of men problem, huge decline in marriage rates, rapid increase in women in universities, a lack of desire to get married because essentially they have a kind of economic shift without any cultural shift. Like we do have some cultural flexibility, but in Japan, it's like what happens is women go to college and they get jobs, but once you're married, you're just expected to be exactly in the old traditional roles. So a lot of people just delay getting married for years and years. So the age of first marriage in Japan has gone up like 7 years, China actually went in a weirdly opposite direction because the communist revolution enforced a kind of male-female equality. So like women had to work and men had to work. And then once the communist revolution ended, it reverted to kind of a natural male-female hierarchy. So they're kind of a few years behind in how it works. So it's a little bit different, and it works a little bit differently in every country. I don't know about India, actually. Yes?
I don't know if this is very common, but in my world I see a lot of young women who are boss. They are strong.
Like in personality, they're the boss?
Well, I mean, the husbands work.
Wait, we're talking about the question is young women who are the boss, but in what way?
Well, I mean, they just, I don't know why that's happening.
Who are these husbands that... This is the question of, does this ring familiar to any of you? young women who just kind of dictate what's going on. So they work. The husband does the feeding and the bathing and the cooking and the sort of dealing with things, and the wife gets to dictate the terms of the house. Do you guys know about this? Is this a common phenomenon? I mean, I don't know. I really honestly think. Well, I think a lot of what happens, this is something, people who track breadwinner wives, there's been a couple of books written about women who are the breadwinners in their family, and a lot of what they find is that when women take on new roles, they don't give up old roles, so women are not very good at that. So like if they're making the money, they still insist on being in charge of the domesticity or the cleanliness of the house or what the children are doing, so it's exhausting. But that does seem to be a phenomenon, a thing. Okay, so the question is that, yeah, I'll repeat the question. Oh, did we have a microphone for the crowd? We do not. I'll repeat the question. Oh, you do have a microphone for the crowd. The question was, I'll just repeat that question. The question was that observation that men want to be more involved in domestic responsibilities in this generation of marriages, and that it's much better because it's much more equal. So So a lot of what people wonder about are, like, remember when I talked about the seesaw marriages and how people trade roles? There is a lot of speculation about, when I say marriages are more stable and happier, that's an official measure. They officially measure how happy are you in your marriage, and sort of college-educated marriages are stronger and more happy now than they have ever been in American history. And one of the reasons that people say that might be true is because there's much less rigidity of roles. So when people are sharing, like, men enjoy there isn't kind of such a rigid, like, you have to do this and you have to do this. So men enjoy partaking in family responsibilities or being part of the domestic sphere, and women enjoy working when they work. I know I'm creating an ideal portrait, but that is, like, sociologically more true now that there's a lot of flexibility about who does what than there ever has been, and it correlates with happy marriages. I don't know if it causes them, but it's a theory. Yes, back there. Oh. Well, you'll do it next.
This isn't based on a scientific sampling, but a number of the women I've spoken with told me the worst boss they've ever had was a woman. And I'm just wondering, how would you interpret that? Like I said, I don't know, is there something to that? Or?
Yeah, women are the worst. No, it's I don't know. I mean, I work with a lot of women. I love them all. But I think I'm going to answer that like in like a brainiac, instead of like, I'll answer that in just like a brainiac way. So it's usually what happens is, this is a really unsatisfying answer, but I'm going to give it to you. There is a tipping point, which is a third, and if there's fewer than a third of whoever in the office, so let's say it's women, which it often is in some industries, fewer than a third, they feel competitive with each other for like the status, and they feel insecure in their situation, and so they feel like you up means me down, and so it creates a lot of tension around. So that might be the answer to your question, whereas if you like pass that tipping point, it eases. I am so happy that there are 4 women who are possible presidential candidates on the Democratic side, because I hate this idea that only one woman can run at a time, and like one woman means that, like what happened between Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton, because it's such a stupid idea, and it's so much better if there's more of them, because then it's not just like woman. It's like, well, there's that one, there's Kamala Harris who did this, and there's Kirsten Gillibrand. You know what I mean? It's just like, you just normalizes them into people. So I think there's something like that happening in the workplace, where it's like, it's because there have been so few of them that they just feel very like clinging to the spot that they have. I promised you all the way in the back is the next person.
Hi, I wanted to make a comment about the little video that you showed about your family. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to that. Noticing that your son was fidgety and moving around, and your daughter was sitting very disciplined, and she said one of her traits is that she's disciplined. And plans and listens, which are very female qualities, and reminded me of what my sons, I have a daughter and a son as well, what my son's pediatrician, Dr. William Sears, told me years ago. He said, the school system is made for girls, by girls. They don't understand boys. And fast forward, my daughter going to college, 60% of college students were girls and 35 to 40% were boys. So there is a crisis on the other side that it seems like in the schools, elementary schools, high schools, there's less playtime, more rigid, more sitting down at desks and tables that's more conducive to girl traits and less really understanding of boys.
Did you say that your pediatrician was actually Dr. Sears?
Dr. William Sears, yes.
That's
yes.
crazy.
Yeah.
I just thought you were going to say the video was cute, and my children are so cute. Well, okay. This is a really, really complicated question. I have a whole chapter about education trying to answer this question. Here's the thing. There was a high school movement at the turn of the century where they tried to encourage young Americans to go to high school. Girls have always been better at school than boys. Always, since there was school, girls were better at school. But nobody thought girls were going anywhere, so it didn't matter that they were better at school. The teachers would still prefer the boys, and the boys would still get grades. Nobody cared that the boys were fidgeting. So as the culture changes and people don't think that anymore, it starts to really matter that girls are better at school, because people don't assume, teachers don't assume one thing or another about boys and girls. In addition, testing has gotten a lot harder, and expectations for children much, much younger. I mean, if any of you have kids, it's like the things that children are expected to do in kindergarten and first grade. Like, I read a book report that I wrote in 6th grade. My mom sent it to me, and I was like, I was so stupid compared to my kids. I was so stupid. I was writing things in 6th grade that they're like writing in kindergarten, you know, and I got like straight A's. Like, the things that they're expected to do by the time they're in kindergarten and first grade are totally impossible for boys to do. They're just not caught up to the girls. So they do develop a sense of themselves very, very early on, and I have 2 sons, as failures in school. They develop a sense of themselves as like, I can't do this thing. Like, this thing that I'm supposed to do, I can't do it. It's not for me. And it's very, very common that boys have that idea about themselves, and I don't really know what to do about it. I mean, you know, I could tell you, oh, there's all sorts of programs sort of adjusting to boys, but the fact is the world requires a certain kind of discipline of you these days that schools are not going to slow down. So I'm not really sure how to square this one. It's like a real problem. And one thing I write about in my book, which was amazing, is none of you are going to believe me, even though this is 100% true. There is a huge amount of affirmative action for men, and particularly white men, in liberal arts colleges in America. This is a known fact, known by the Office of Civil Rights. People have tried a million times to get them to document it. They started to document it, and the Obama administration shut it down because the left doesn't want to know about it. They don't want to say that it's true and they don't like it, but it is absolutely true that schools practice, colleges practice affirmative action, that if you have an equivalent boy and a girl trying to get into a college, because the colleges are too female. So state schools at this point are like 63% female, and they don't want that. So the only response to that is affirmative action for men, which is what is happening. Boom. All right. Yes. Yes, you. You're getting the mic. Don't worry about it. It's coming. So we can't move that fast.
No, I want to ask you a question. In the 70s and 80s, when people graduated from college, usually women used to get married at age 22 and men maybe at 24. So they started family in much younger age group. Today, thank you for knowing the accent.
Yes.
But today, people are aged 25 to 40. Most of them don't get married. This is the fastest growing segment of the American population. The question is, because they cohabit, but they don't get married and don't have children as early. And the age group of marriage is 29 for women and about 32 for men. Do you think this has some impact on the fact that women are more free and can proceed and pursue their job, their career?
Absolutely. It's not that old. I mean, the age of first marriage has changed a ton in a very, very short time in America and most countries. I mean, there's so many reasons for it. Yes, part of it is freedom. Part of it is the way people date. Part of it is fertility technology. Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is for the first time about to be at non-replacement fertility like European countries. And so yeah, I mean, but okay. I mean, also like the planet has too many people. I'm not sure I feel tragically about the fact that people are getting married later and having fewer children. It doesn't necessarily seem like a terrible thing, but it is definitely happening. Do you feel like it's a terrible thing? Your face is saying it's a terrible thing. Oh, that's a class difference. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the explosion of single motherhood in working class America does not seem like a good phenomenon. If it were me, I would not fix the problem by talking about marriage, because I think history never moves in that direction. Like, it never, ever has ever moved backwards. So I never understand when the conservatives talk about that, because it's not going to move backwards. But I would fix the problem by doing what European countries do, which is changing your idea of what a family is. So a family is a collection of people who live in the house and raise a child, like making it a little looser and easier to get to access social services or tax breaks or whatever it is you need by being able to call yourself a family in a certain kind of configuration. I mean, nobody in Europe gets married and they still manage to sort of have households and raise, so that you can have a kind of looser support system, because people are not going to just start getting married. They're not going to. That ship has sailed. Yes.
In your research, did you notice any cultural or ethnic differences?
Yes. Are there cultural and ethnic differences in America? So there absolutely are. So African American urban communities went through this phenomenon in the 60s and 70s, because that's when industries which were primarily black and had left the city. This same phenomenon that happened in Detroit happened in Alabama 30 years later to white Americans living in Alabama. So at the time that I was writing in this book, it was mostly white communities who were suffering, but it had been communities of color. Latinos are sort of second generation end of men phenomenon, sort of less marriage, more single motherhood. So I think it just like hits different ethnic communities at different points. And Asian communities generally have a higher rate of marriage than other communities in America, both Asian marriages and Asian intermarriages. I don't know why that is, but that is true. Do we have time? Just one more? How about one? 2 more questions. Okay. And then we'll go on and enjoy. Yes. You, yes. Oh, microphone.
I know you talk a lot about backlash with these men feeling left out or judged, but my question is, I feel like sometimes as a woman, I have a higher standard for other women than I do for men. And for example, in the Kavanaugh hearings, I expected more of the women senators than what we got. And I just wondered if there's some kind of
expected more, like
expected maybe
morally you're expected more
to abandon their political connection and do the right thing.
I hate this. I do it too. It drives me crazy. Like, we just expect women. We look at Sarah Huckabee standards and we're like, one day.
Or just in general,
I don't know.
Do women have higher standards for women?
Are you asking me if it's cool that you have the higher standards for women? Because I don't know. No, it's that thing that I was saying about the Xerox machine. Like, we just have this kind of, we cannot get rid of this expectation that women behave communally and that they are, I really think it's a huge problem. Like, it's just a cultural expectation that women sort of subsume themselves, and I don't even know what the right word is, that they are, it's a maternal expectation or something, that they should do the right thing, they should be thinking of others, they should have a degree of selflessness that we don't expect of men. I mean, it's lovely. I don't have a problem with it. I work with a lot of women. I think they're nice to work with, and they're really communal, but there is a part of me that feels like that enduring cultural expectation is a real problem. Like, it holds women back a lot. So yeah, I mean, just think about what we do with the wives of, remember Melania's secretly, she's secretly holding a rebellion of her own. It's like, no, she's not, but we just can't help it. All right, one more.
Hi, I taught in the school systems for 45 years. Mainly,
Congratulations.
Yeah. And I also did other things, including working in Washington, D.C. and so forth. And I kind of take a different opinion about what's happened to the boys. When I went to school, and I graduated from high school in 1958, the boys were always considered smarter than the girls. I mean, I had to fight to get into an algebra class at that time. But I did not, and I went into the so-called college prep courses. And in those college prep courses, there were mainly boys, and none of them had antsy, squirrely, discipline, not able to focus problems. And that was at Whittier High School, where they had 3,500 students at Whittier. So I saw the change. My first graduating class would be 1963. And the boys I had in that class, I was only 23 years old, so you can only imagine what that was about. But they were men. They acted like men. They took responsibility. They were mensch. And it didn't make any difference if they were in the shop class or they were going off to Stanford. And through the years, I saw more and more and more excuses being made for the boys not meeting standards. And by the time I left teaching and retired in 2003, I used to have meetings where the fathers would come in or whatever, and it was never the young man's responsibility. It was my problem that this boy picked up a chair and threw it at me. Literally. And I, fortunately, had been the leader of the teachers union and led a task force for youth at risk for the state of California, and I won't go into all the details. And I had the confidence, and I knew I had the background, and to be able to take this man and say, you know what, my brothers fought in World War II. And they left school at age 17 to do that. And I said, and your son is picking up a chair and throwing it at me. I said, what's happening here? So, and then we had the issue where, oh, well, let's put the boys in later. Let's hold them back because they're not mature enough. And yet when I went to kindergarten, there were boys that were younger than I there, and I graduated from high school at age 17. So I really don't know what's happening with our boys. And I worry about it, and I'm concerned about it. And because I think I see in Denmark and other studies in other countries, this isn't happening so much at what I call the royal jelly level. And
well, you're not the only one who thinks that. Jordan Peterson has a big theory about the sissification of boys, and they can't do anything for themselves. And I always remember there was a woman who does college acceptance wrote a kind of confessional to the New York Times, and she said, oh, when girls come in to do their college applications, it's like, who should I meet with? What should I do? They're like taking all the notes. And when the boys come in, their moms come with them and are like, what should they do? And they're like, and then they get the essays and they're like, oh, that's a nice essay your mom wrote for you. So I don't know how to answer that. Like, have boys become, I worry about that with my sons all the time. Like, why am I, is there some way in which, why have the expectations lowered? Yeah. I don't know.
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Please join us for dinner, and thank you, Hanna Rosin.